Welcome back. So discourse around reparations for countries who were previously oppressed at the hands of colonial settlers is an ongoing one without much progress, but a few admissions and apologies. The Advocacy Team and Development Reimagined have released a new paper that details financing possibilities and suggestions on financing structures. Reparations are intended, of course, to help nations emerging from racial injustice, colonialism and dictatorships to recognize and address the causes and effects of human rights breaches. But for more on this, we speak to the Advocacy Team founder and director, Lorriann Robinson. Lorriann, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I didn't think that a conversation like this was possible, right? A discussion around for us to even talk about reparations for countries on the African continent that have come out of colonialism. Start us off with where that discussion actually started for you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and thank you for inviting us to talk about this report. Yeah, so for me, I can speak personally to say that, you know, my heritage is from the Caribbean. So for us, it is for the people who are descendants of that legacy of slavery. It is a conversation that we've always had. I've never known a time when we were not talking about reparations. And the reason, of course, is because reparations did not happen, and because there was no attempt to financially compensate the people who experienced slavery at the time when slavery ended, or at the time when colonialism was ended. The question never went away. So for us, it has always been a conversation. What has changed is that I think people are now listening. And so the political leaders in the Caribbean have always advocated for reparations. They have a 10-point plan, etc. They've been making the call. They are now making it much more powerfully, and we see leaders like Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, really going on the global stage and talking about this powerfully. But I think what has changed in recent years is that people are listening, and that there are more voices. And so actually in recent years we see more African leaders also joining this call and saying that we need to give attention to the issue of reparations. So there's more. The voices calling for it are louder. There are many, and I pay tribute to the many campaigners who were banging this drum when nobody was paying attention to it. And, you know, it's an issue that has had its time. And I think we see those early signs that political leaders, especially in Europe, for whom we are calling for reparations from in many cases, are now starting to listen.
Can we talk about some of the examples that you also, put in the report, where we have seen reparations granted to countries that have, fallen victim to colonialism and I suppose racial injustice, right? You talk about the case of the Mau Mau of Kenya versus the British government.
Yes, I can talk about that. And maybe if I can say too, that we thought that this report was important because as much as there has been a lot of discussion about the political case, the moral case for reparations, in order for it to happen, we need to delve into the detail of how it can be paid for. And that's what our report is trying to do. So as you've just said, it looks at some examples of where reparations have been paid. The Mau Mau case was a case of reparations through legal challenge. That was one of the tools that we looked at in the report. It actually doesn't score very well, and that's because for all of the possible ways that reparations could be paid for, we also developed a criteria to try to test, well, what that would look like. So we said, well, if you take each mechanism, well, how much money can it generate? How long will it take for the payments to be made? How transparent is it as a kind of mechanism? Is it very good at reaching the most vulnerable, the people who most needed it? That's an equity criteria. So we had a criteria of 15 things. And with something like reparations through legal challenge, the reason it doesn't score very well is that it puts a huge burden on the recipient. So the people who have faced the injustice have to take a huge financial risk, a huge risk in terms of time. It takes many years. It comes with a risk. So this is not a mechanism that scored very highly in our report.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the case of that Mau Mau of Kenya versus the British government. And of course, again, that was a legal process there. But that ended up with the British government agreeing to pay 19.9 million euros to the Mau Mau. This is for human rights violations, torture, imprisonment that occurred in the 1950s. And then I think of the example, for instance, of Namibia, right, where there was that genocide in Namibia, Germany issuing an apology. And then I think it was in 2021, Germany agreed to fund projects to the tune of, I think, what is it, a billion euros? And I need to, of course, clarify those numbers. Yeah, 1.1 billion euros or 1.2 billion euros over 30 years. There's something that has to be said about the numbers that are put forward, right? And talk to me about how, you know, what is the appropriate number to make up for genocide?
There is no appropriate number to make up for genocide, and that is the answer. I think the other side of this coin is that those governments that are increasingly calling for reparations also need to do their homework, and they also need to really investigate and understand what reparations for what is it that we want reparations to do, how is it that we want reparations to transform our societies, and what will this cost. And that might be transformation in terms of their infrastructure, education, health, etc. But I think it says in any case, if I'm going to make a claim to you that you have caused damage to me, I need to say, well, this is the cost, and I need to show the process about how I've calculated that cost. So there have been many attempts to quantify what is owed. As you just said, there is no one mechanism, there's no one agreed formula, but I think it's important work. But maybe just for a little bit of context too, just to give you a sense of the scale, we can look at history to give us a set of precedent. Because what is not often widely understood is that when slavery ended, there was reparations paid, there was compensation paid. So the UK government compensated the owners of enslaved people, the slave owners, to the tune of £20 million in 1833. Yeah. And that was the equivalent of 40% of the Treasury's budget at that time, and it took 182 years to pay off. So that gives you a sense of the scale at which they themselves calculated the value, the value of the free labor that had been taken, the free labor that was experienced during slavery. So that gives you a sense of the scale, but there is no one way of calculating it. And I think every government has to make that calculation for themselves, perhaps do it collectively, and really think through reparations for what. What is it that we're going to use it for? How is it this going to transform our societies?
Yeah, I'm really quite interested in the various examples, right? And I think that it's just a fascinating discussion because there are so many vehicles really that you put forward in the report that have been used to pay reparations. The High Indebted Poor Countries Initiative?
Yes, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiatives is an example of, that debate was not directly linked to historical injustice, but there was definitely an understanding at the time that much of the debt that this initiative tried to help countries to address was the result of a set of unfair playing fields. And actually debt is one of the mechanisms that come out in the top 3 of our report. But crucially, we say that these things should be used together. And debt is back on the agenda in a way that few people would have imagined just a few years ago. And what we saw is that as a result of the pandemic and a lot of the spending that governments had to do to support their citizens as they went through the pandemic, it has caused a new debt crisis. And so debt is back on the political agenda in a way that few people would have expected. And debt cancellation actually scored quite highly across the criteria in our report. Yeah. But importantly, we would say that debt cancellation by itself is not enough, and it needs to be matched with some of the other policy tools as well.
I wonder if there's perhaps a concern of what one would call overlapping responsibility, right? So with Kazakhstan, for instance, as a vehicle for reparations, they had the Green Climate Fund, which I think is particularly interesting when we are at a time when developing nations are asking the developed nations to assist them in preparing for climate-linked atrocities and tragedies, right? And to assist them even with energy changes and reform. But where we start to then bring those conversations together of the shared responsibility of dealing with climate change versus reparation, is that not mixing and pooling together responsibilities?
Yes, well, I think for us, the two things are absolutely linked. And so our report looks at mechanisms, reparations across the board. So whether for historical injustices or for loss and damage. And so there are parallels. Also, the two things are not disconnected too. The history of those historical injustices is linked to exploitations of the land and of the environment, which means that many of the countries that are calling for reparations for historical injustices are also bearing the biggest brunt of the environmental disaster that we need climate reparations to address. And they're the people who contributed the least. And that's why they're connected, because the countries that have contributed the most to causing the climate crisis have a responsibility to support those countries that are at the front line of having to deal with it, to do so.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's mixed messaging. For me, they are very much connected. And the fact is that governments are not necessarily waiting for others, whether to deal with the legacy of slavery or colonialism, or to deal with the climate crisis. When a disaster or when a hurricane or when a natural disaster occurs, governments are dealing with it.
Yeah.
But they are also saying at the same time, we will use whatever resources we have, but those who contributed the most to this, you also have a responsibility, and you have to come on board and you have to help us to do this. Right. I think as it was Mia Motley who said that if I see my neighbor's house on fire and I go across to help, that's charity. But if I help to cause the fire, that gives me a different responsibility, and I think that applies here too.
Yeah, very, very interesting. I mean, just final thoughts really on who you want the report to go to, who's interacting with it, and also how we can take a look at some of your work as well.
Thank you. So we really hope that policymakers in the treasuries across Europe will look at this, and we hope that it will help to demystify it. So reparations stops being this scary thing where they say people are asking for trillions of pounds or dollars or euros, and actually that they can look at these and say, well, actually, these are tools that are part of our playbook for how we run the treasury, and we hope that it will help to demystify it, and so they can see in really practical terms how this reparations could happen. And on the other side, we hope that that policymakers in Africa, in Caribbean countries, in other countries that are on the front line of climate or have experienced historical injustice, that they also study these mechanisms and they start thinking, okay, so we want reparations, but for what purpose and how do we want the reparations to be paid? Because how it's paid makes a huge difference. If it's done badly, it could exacerbate some of the problems that countries are seeing.
Yeah.
Well, so I hope this will become a playbook for those governments who are calling for reparations too. And yes, you can see more of our work, and we encourage you to also look at our partners at Development Reimagined. So you can check out the Advocacy Team's website. You can check out Development Reimagined. Please follow us on socials. And we are continuing with webinars, with events. We are really hoping to really take this conversation to decision makers. And we think the time is long, long, long overdue.
Yeah.